Everyone knows Augustus and Trajan were great emperors. Everyone knows that Caligula and Commodus were terrible emperors. But there are a couple of Roman rulers who get either too little praise or too much criticism. And in this video I'm going to list the 4 Roman emperors who in my opinion are the most underrated. The 4th most underrated emperor on my list is Valens. Most of the criticism lobbed at Valens is true. The Gothic crisis and the Battle of Adrianople would forever define his legacy. Valens had made 2 big mistakes in his career, and those 2 mistakes combined turned what could have been an advantageous situation for the Romans into the biggest crisis since the 3rd century. The first mistake was his appointments for overseeing the settlement of the Goths. As we know, Valens' plan for the barbarians was to settle the families in Roman territory and recruit the able-bodied men for his campaign against Persia. The orders he issued to his subordinates were all to this effect: treat the Goths decently and give them enough land. But the local army commander Lupicinus and Dux Maximus acted in direct contradiction to those orders. They starved and extorted the Goths, which caused the revolt. At the outset of the crisis, the Goths did not pose in a military threat, but because they were pushed to the breaking point, they decided that violence is the only way for them to survive. Because Valens was busy in the east at the time, he had to rely on his subordinates, so the blame is not entirely his own, but he still deserves a part of it for having such terrible subordinates. His second fatal mistake was engaging the Goths at Adrianople. He refused to wait for the reinforcements and started the battle with an exhausted army on unfavorable terrain with incomplete information about the enemy, and it cost him his army and his life. Once again, part of the blame for this lays on his advisors, but he should have got better advisors. Adrianople turned out to be a huge disaster for the empire, but we should not think that this was entirely Valens' fault, and forget the rest of his achievements as the emperor. First of all, Valens did a great job at pacifying the Goths early in his reign. A part of the reason that the barbarians were mostly docile at the beginning of the crisis is that they had been beaten by Valens 8 years before. In the beginning of his reign, Valens had put down the revolt of Procopius, and then led a punitive campaign against the Goths who supported the usurper. In between the 2 encounters with the Goths, Valens had been very active both on the eastern frontiers and in the administration of the empire. In the east, he was embroiled in another bout of struggle over Armenia against the Persians. This whole affair was a legacy of Julian's bungled campaign, and Valens should be given some credit for keeping the Persians at bay with limited resources at his disposal. He also had to deal with the revolts of Isaurians and Saracens, which further limited military power he could spare for the Danube frontier. Domestically, Valens was actually a pretty great emperor. He was very frugal in his spendings and did increase tax efficiency. One of his biggest achievements was finishing the construction of the longest aqueduct in the empire. The aqueduct of Valens stands to this day in the city of Istanbul. If it hadn't been for Adrianople, Valens would have been remembered as a very competent emperor. Not in the top 10 of all time, but maybe in the top 20. And yeah, Adrianople was a huge disaster, but one bad deed should not wash away all the good. And for this reason, I think that Emperor Valens is very underrated. You know how I can tell that Constantius III is underrated? I had a hard time finding any information about him on the internet while making this video. When it comes to the restorers of the empire, most Roman history enthusiasts can at least name Aurelian. Some people would also remember Probus or Majorian. But one guy barely gets any recognition, and that's Constantius III. Granted, he was an emperor for a very short period, and most of his campaigns happened during his tenure as Magister Militum, but what he managed to do during this period is absolutely remarkable. In 410 AD, Rome and Italy were reeling from the aftermath of the Gothic sack. Roman Gaul and Britain were under control of the usurper Constantine III, and in Spain, various tribes from beyond the Rhine were ransacking the countryside. 10 years later, none of these problems remained. Constantius first swiftly dealt with the usurper Constantine, who was threatening the Italy from beyond the Alps. After putting down another Gallic usurper called Gallienus, he proceeded to contain the Goths by denying them provision. Constantius literally starved the Goths into revolting against their leadership and electing the leaders who were willing to submit to the Romans in exchange for supplies. His best diplomatic move was using the subdued Goths to crush the barbarians in Hispania. This way he managed to wipe out half of the Vandals and most of the Alans at almost no cost in Roman manpower. The crossing of the Rhine and the Alaric's campaign could have resulted in the loss of Roman control of not only Britain, but Spain and Gaul as well. And that didn't happen only thanks to Constantius III, who regained most of the territory by the time of his untimely death in 421. His elevation to the purple in 420 is almost an afterthought, considering he was effectively the ruler of the Western Empire for a decade by then. It is probably because of the shortness of his official reign that people forget how instrumental he was for Rome to survive the second decade of the 5th century. Had he been Augustus this whole time, Constantius would be talked about in the same terms as Majorian. Another reason we remember him so little is that his star gets eclipsed by a black hole of Honorius' incompetence. Who knows how long the empire would have lasted if Honorius didn't have his Magister Militum to do his job for him. The work Constantius did to restore order to the empire in the aftermath of the Gothic sack shouldn't be understated, but it very often is. And this is why I think that Constantius III is one of the most underrated of the Roman emperors. The second most underrated emperor in my opinion is Domitian. The reason for Domitian's reputation in the ancient sources is well understood. Domitian despised the Senate and didn't care one bit what they thought of him. To top that, he actively curtailed their privileges, favoring equestrians of merit over senatorial elite for high appointments. This obviously didn't sit well with the senatorial elite, who did eventually assassinate him and condemn his memory. If you read the original sources about Domitian, you'd think he was some kind of psychotic villain. Today, however, we can assess him more objectively and conclude that he was generally active and competent, though absolutely indelicate in his dealings with the Senate. His refusal to appease the Senate was, however, borderline irrational and did have a negative effect on his policies. And his policies were sound. He made an effort to ensure long-term health of the Roman economy and the security of the borders. He improved coinage and campaigned beyond the Rhine. Their fortifications of Lamis Germanicus were substantially improved during his reign. Another objective criticism of Domitian, apart from his irrational disdain for the Senate, is the handling of the Dacian War. This one probably shouldn't be defended, since almost everyone around Domitian told him that providing funds and artisans for the Dacians was a bad idea. But this is a single black spot in his track record of sound external policy decisions and shouldn't be taken as an indicator of incompetence. Overall, Domitian did a surprisingly good job as an emperor, considering the Senate was more of an obstacle for him than help. His meritocratic approach to the government, economic reforms, and defensive infrastructure projects were among the reasons for the empire's success under the 5 good emperors. When the influx of gold into the economy followed Trajan's campaign, the empire flourished in no small way thanks to Domitian's previous work. Luckily for us, modern historians don't have personal grudges against Domitian, and have partially rehabilitated his image. But I still don't think Domitian gets enough credit for the work he did. And the most underrated emperor in my opinion is Gallienus. Gallienus, like Domitian, suffers from Senate relations problem. Unlike Domitian, it didn't really affect his reign, since the Senate was largely irrelevant at that point. All they managed to do was tarnish his reputation and paint him the source of all Rome's problems in the chronicles. And Rome surely did have a lot of problems during Gallienus' reign. His 15 years as emperor can be considered the lowest point of the empire until the downfall of the West. But without the work he did, it might as well have been the final point of the empire. Gallienus was elevated to the rank of Augustus by his father Valerian in 253 AD. They have divided the empire between them. Valerian took charge of the east, while Gallienus ruled the western provinces. The first 7 years of Gallienus' reign can be considered less turbulent, but even then he campaigned ceaselessly against the barbarian invaders from Lower Danube to Lower Rhine. Then, in 260, all hell broke loose. Valerian was taken prisoner by the Persians, On this news, a revolt in Pannonia broke out. When Gallienus went to quell this revolt, his general Postumus killed the emperor's son and proclaimed his own realm in Gaul, Spain, and Britannia. Gallienus killed one usurper and went to deal with the other, but got delayed because the Alemanni invaded Italy. Gallienus crushed the Alemanni, but in the meantime another usurper revolted in the Balkans, then another one in the east, then one in Egypt. While it's all happening, the eastern provinces are being overrun by the Persians. The Goths take to the sea and are ransacking Greece. And I almost forgot to mention that during all this time, the pandemic of Cyprian plague has been ravaging the empire, reducing its manpower and tax base. These circumstances seem almost too terrible to be true, but that was what Gallienus had to deal with. In the second half of his reign, he had to play the ultimate survivor. So he reformed the military to deal with invasions more efficiently. He moved the base of operation to Mediolanum to be closer to the frontiers. And he took his army and went on to deal with each crisis one by one. When faced with problems on all fronts, you need to prioritize what to tackle first. And Gallienus, in my opinion, excelled at that. He accepted the arrangement with Odenathus, where the latter would deal with the problems in the east in exchange for more autonomy. At each step, Gallienus identified the most urgent problem and tackled it first. Every attempt at usurpation was put down, and every invasion was repelled. Aurelian deservedly gets a huge credit for restoring the empire, but if it wasn't for Gallienus, Aurelian would not have an empire to restore. The only problem Gallienus left unsolved was the breakaway Gallic Empire. But even there, he did get a beachhead on the other side of the Alps, which made Aurelian's later campaign much easier. Throughout all this peril, Gallienus did not forget the domestic policies. He patronized the arts so the populace of what was left of the empire would not fall into despair. He ended the persecution against the Christians, which alleviated social tension. And he reserved the military posts for the lower classes, which provided them with opportunities for social mobility. Ironically, this reform also earned him his terrible reputation in ancient sources. The senatorial class did not take this exclusion lightly, and they were the ones writing the histories. I have to also mention the personal aspect of Gallienus' story. It is hard to imagine the despair a man can sink into when he is betrayed by the ones he trusts, his son is killed by the traitors, and his own father is being held prisoner and humiliated by his enemies. Some sources say that while besieging Postumus at one of the Gallic cities, Gallienus had even challenged the usurper to a single combat. This shows you just how fed up he was with everything at that point. In his 15 years as the emperor, Gallienus has poured his soul and his life to keep the empire afloat, so his successors would have a chance at restoring it to its former glory. But he never gets mentioned among its greatest rulers. Because of this, I think that Gallienus is the most underrated Roman emperor. I hope you found this video interesting. If you think that someone else belongs on this list, please let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.